Hello, High Rock. I'm John, one of the pastors here, and it's my privilege to kick off our Advent series. Advent is the season that leads up to Christmas. It's a season when we build up our anticipation for the arrival of Jesus, not just 2,000 years ago, but our anticipation for his return. And I'll let you in on a little secret. It's my favorite season of the year. Yes, I know it's supposed to be Easter, especially since I'm a pastor, but I can't help but love the magic of Christmas. Maybe it's because so many of my favorite childhood memories are embedded in this season. Maybe it's because out of the 5 love languages, my biggest one is receiving gifts. Right there, dead center. I know I'm a bit of an odd duck, and when someone who loves me spends the time and thought to get me the right gift, I feel loved. Like when my family got me the Bug Assault 3.0, which uses non-toxic table salt to kill flies from several feet away. I felt so known. I imagine that many of you are like me, about Advent and Christmas, not insect-slaying shotguns. This season can be such a wonderful time filled with hope, peace, joy, and love. It's a time of anticipation and excitement. So why does Matthew's gospel start us out with 17 verses of a genealogy? So-and-so begat so-and-so, and so on and so on. Let's be honest. Don't we read about it a third of the way through and then just skip a bit? I remember when I first tried to read through the Bible as a new believer, I was off to a pretty good start until I arrived at the 4th book, Numbers. That's the book where New Year's resolutions go to die. That book is just filled with so-and-so begat so-and-so from start to finish. So why does Matthew start us off in exactly the same way? It's hard to even know how to pronounce some of the names. I felt bad for the scripture reader this week. The first church I attended when I became a believer in college was a small startup church that rented a lecture hall at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health. Probably half of the people in our church were Nigerian graduate students. When I shared my frustration with reading the Bible and my desire to skip all the genealogies, Brother Bola pushed back on my lack of patience. He told me that where he came from, the genealogies were some of their favorite parts of Scripture. In his culture, they believed that you could not truly know who you are unless you know who you come from. He encouraged me, if I were to spend more time unpacking the stories of the people in those genealogies, it would enrich my understanding of Jesus and even my own place in the family of God. Brother Bola, dropping knowledge. I still can't say that I've gone over every name in the genealogies in Numbers, but I have in Matthew's list, and I now have an appreciation of why Matthew begins the first Advent with a reminder of where Jesus comes from, along with an invitation for us to enter into the family of God as well. One more thought before we dive in. It sounds like a wonderful invitation to be invited to join the family of God. My family of origin was very dysfunctional, so the thought of being part of a new family was very appealing. The thought of being given a new identity with a distinguished lineage sounded wonderful. But if I was going to reorient my entire life and identity, it wasn't enough that it was very inviting. It also had to be true. Too much was at stake. I didn't want to build my life on wishful thinking. I love reading fantasy, but I don't want to base my identity on one. If I'm going to trust my life to this story, this family tree, it had better be true. It's like if I come to a bridge over a rapid river on a hike. It's nice if the bridge is beautiful. It's great if it's built with sustainable materials that are eco-friendly. But more than anything, I want to know that it will hold me up when I step on it. It's the same with a story. If it's not true, then I'm going to keep looking. So, is Christmas true? Did God really and truly walk among us in the flesh? If it's true, then it changes everything for me. But only if it's true. Maybe that's your question. Or maybe you're asking a different question. What do you need to know about something in order to believe in it? Is it important that it is historical and factual? Does it need to be authentic and free of pretense? Should it be something that brings about goodness and justice in the world? Does it need to be beautiful and inclusive? When it comes to believing in something, especially something as significant as Christmas, we all have a question that matters most to us. This Advent, we'll look at each of these questions in order to appreciate how Christmas addresses both our deepest fears and our greatest hopes. And starting today with, is it true? Let's uncover some of the truth we encounter in the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience. They would recognize these names even if we don't. And they had a lot of questions, maybe even some objections. Matthew both anticipates his audience's objections and delivers the answers if we know how to read between the lines. First, a quick word about the structure. Matthew divides this genealogy into 3 sections of 14. Why 14? No one knows for sure, but probably the strongest theory is that David is the focal point of this genealogy because, to Matthew's Jewish audience, David was their national hero. There are a lot of kings in this list, but only David is highlighted with that title. And in ancient Hebrew, they don't have numerals. They use letters for numbers. So every word has a numerical value, and David's name equals 14. So 3 groups of 14 ancestors each. The first group of 14 starts with Abraham and leads up to David. That was Israel's good period. The next group of 14 starts with David's son Solomon and leads through a series of evil kings, culminating with Israel's captivity in Babylon. This was Israel's time of shame. The last group of 14 are mostly people we don't know much about until we get to Joseph, Jesus' adoptive father. These names would have been present in the temple records, verifying Jesus' status as a descendant of David, but after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, those records were lost. After that, no one would ever be able to prove they were a descendant of David, an absolute requirement to be God's promised Messiah. So that's the structure. It highlights King David and anticipates the objection that Jesus would have to be a descendant of King David. Of all the reasons people had to reject Jesus, his father Joseph's connection to King David was never in doubt. What is in doubt is Jesus' connection to Joseph, and we'll get back to that later. So that's the structure. What about the actual names? This is a genealogy that covers almost 2,000 years. So Matthew is being highly selective in choosing who to include, and there's a lot of meaning packed into those choices. The first group of 14 were mostly national heroes. They are the people you'd be proud to have in your family tree. The second group of 14 were mostly scoundrels. Some of them were the worst of the worst. If you looked up each of those kings, you would find some of the most tragic human beings in the entire Old Testament. If you were sharing your family tree with someone, would you highlight your connection to people of great shame? Since this is Jesus' family tree, I think we can conclude that Jesus had a very human family. There are some really good people in the mix, but by and large, we're talking about a pretty dysfunctional family tree. Sometimes people today think that Jesus could never identify with their broken families. I think you'd be surprised. But more than that, we can see that Matthew is not trying to hide any inconvenient truths. His honesty makes him credible. His honesty doesn't make his testimony true, but it makes him worth listening to. Matthew loads up his genealogy with a few other surprises. For one thing, these types of genealogies almost never included women. Matthew is recording Jesus' right to sit on David's throne, something that passes through the men. But Matthew chooses to include 4 women. But Matthew does not choose to include the women we would expect, like heroes like Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel. Instead, Matthew includes Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Why these 4? What do these women have in common? Well, first off, all 4 of these women were either Gentiles or of questionable ancestry. They were not Jewish. They were women born as outsiders. By including these four women, Matthew anticipates the objection that Jesus and his followers were welcoming people outside of Israel into the Jewish faith. We have to remember that Jesus and all his initial followers were Jewish. As foretold, Jesus came to fulfill the promises God made to the Jewish people. But Jesus is much more than that. The original promise to Abraham was that his descendants would be a blessing to all nations. This idea was not popular. If you remember our series on the book of Acts, the Jewish Christians were shocked every time God included Gentiles, non-Jews, into the family of faith. After the Apostle Peter went to the household of Cornelius, a Gentile, Peter had to apologize to the Jewish believers because God had made Cornelius' family part of the family of faith. Peter even said, "Who was I to oppose God?" Today, people sometimes wonder whether or not a Jew can follow Jesus. But back then, they wondered whether anyone but a Jew could follow Jesus. But by choosing these four women, Matthew anticipates his audience's objection and shows that Jesus is not doing anything new by including Gentiles, because God has always been doing so. In today's world, opening up the door for all people would not raise any objections. But for them, it was a huge objection. And Matthew shows that the truth is that it was God's plan all along. Objection answered. However, there's something else that connects these four women. In the culture of the ancient world, each of these four women would be sexually suspect. Tamar in Genesis 38, Rahab in Joshua 2 and 6, Ruth in Ruth 3, and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11. If you read each of their stories, you will find behavior that is highly suggestive or even shocking. I'll leave it to you to go and read their stories, but suffice it to say that they were the kinds of stories that folks would expect to talk about in hushed whispers, not see as highlights in the genealogy of the promised Messiah. To be clear, the Bible does not call these women into question. In fact, Judah declares Tamar's righteousness. Rahab is referred to as a hero of the faith. Ruth has an entire book written about her in which she is the hero. And yet, questions were undoubtedly raised. And to this list of suspects, Matthew adds a final one. Mary, the Virgin Mary, yet another woman in the ancestry of Jesus whose virtue would be called into question. Matthew anticipates this objection, and by selecting these four other women to include, it's as if Matthew is saying that it's the same as it ever was. There have always been women used by God whose virtue was called into question by men who did not understand or believe the whole story. So don't be surprised when no one believes Mary. Don't be surprised because it's always been that way. In reading the stories about Jesus, people often notice how Jesus was so comfortable with the kind of women who were seen by many as sexually suspect. Jesus protected the woman caught in adultery. He praised the ostracized bleeding woman who grabbed the corner of his robe in faith. In a society where unrelated men and women did not even touch one another, Jesus allowed a prostitute to anoint him with oil and use her hair to wipe her tears from him. Jesus shattered the cultural norms in ways that were absolutely scandalous. In each encounter and many more, he tenderly and resolutely defended the honor of women who were considered sexually suspect. And I find myself wondering if Jesus learned this attitude from his Father. Not just his heavenly Father, with God selecting Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba to include in this list, but also his earthly adoptive father, Joseph, and how he went to such great pains to protect Mary, a woman whose unusual condition must have tempted him to believe the worst and these feelings of betrayal and shame. Now, this is all good and beautiful and authentically real, embracing the highlight and highlighting the uncomfortable aspects of the story. But is it true? In all these ways, Matthew shows that he is a reliable witness, but is what he actually said factually true? When I was in the third grade, my best friend and classmate was a kid named Rob. And one year, right before Christmas, Rob told me that he didn't believe in Santa. I was in shock. But he told me that his parents told him that it's just a story. It's not true. It's just pretend. Now, as soon as I got home, I rushed inside and asked my parents. And they assured me that Santa was real. The story was true. But then why would Rob's parents lie to him? My parents suggested that maybe Santa doesn't go to his house and his parents just don't want him to feel bad. But Rob was my best friend and he seemed like someone who would be on Santa's nice list. He was certainly nicer than me. But I trusted my parents, and so I decided to believe them. But you know what they say? Trust but verify. So that Christmas, I snuck out of my bed. Or in Christmas lingo, when out on the lawn I heard such a clatter, I rose from my bed to see what was the matter. And what to my wondering eyes should appear but two parents wrapping presents to put under the tree. I was devastated. I had stood up for my parents against my best friend Rob. I had asked them to their faces if the stories about Santa were true. I had believed in a lie. A well-meaning lie, but still a lie. Maybe that's why I was so skeptical of the Christian story. Sure, Matthew tells a beautiful story in his gospel, and he sure seems like a reliable witness, but I want to see some real evidence. I guess in 50 years I haven't really changed, at least not in that way. And that's why I want to cover one final aspect of this story, one that points to God's miraculous intervention. Once again, Matthew anticipates an important objection, and it's one we probably wouldn't see, even if we looked over this genealogy for hours. Remember that David was their hero. They were waiting for a son of David, a descendant of David, to come to their rescue. God had made a promise to King David. 2 Samuel 7 says, "Your house," God says, "your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." Someone from David's line would one day rule forever, the promised Messiah. But there was a problem, a big problem. Remember how most of that second group of 14 people in Matthew's genealogy were scoundrels? That group of 14 ends with the worst of the worst, Jeconiah. Actually, when I say that, you're supposed to shudder like this. Ooh. Let's try it again. Are you ready? The worst of the worst, Jeconiah. Ooh. Good. So what was so bad about Jeconiah? Ooh. Actually, you know what? You don't have to do that anymore. What was so bad about this king? He's the king who was responsible for so much of the misery in the prophet Jeremiah's life. Jeconiah's father killed Jeremiah's predecessor, so like father, like son, in this case. By the time Jeconiah is on the throne, faithfulness was so rare in Israel that God sent them into captivity in Babylon. In the early 1900s, a German archaeological expedition in Iraq was uncovering the Ishtar Gate in the ancient city of Babylon when they came across this clay tablet. This tablet was dated to around 580 BC, which itself is incredible. But what's more incredible is that it mentions King Jeconiah and his sons by name, confirming the biblical account of his captivity in Babylon. I think that is so amazingly cool, unlike King Jeconiah himself. In fact, he was so bad that this is what God said to him through the prophet Jeremiah. This is what the Lord says. "Record this man as if childless, a man who will not prosper in his lifetime, for none of his offspring will prosper, none will sit on the throne of David or rule anymore in Judah." That's bad, right? You have no idea. And I had no idea either the first time I read this. This word from God says clearly that none of his physical descendants would ever be allowed to be king, which means none of them could fulfill the promise to David, and none of them could ever be the promised Messiah. The royal line was cut off. This isn't like Game of Thrones or something where you can just fly in on a dragon and take charge. Only God can establish the eternal king. But what about God's promises to David concerning his throne and kingdom? The birthright, the right to rule, passed through David, then Solomon. But because of Jeconiah, this curse also passes alongside the birthright, bound together. Jeconiah's children are the only ones who have the right to rule, but all his children have the curse so that they cannot rule. It's a catch-22. God can't go back on his word. God is caught in a self-made trap. If God doesn't let the descendants of Jeconiah rule, then he's a liar. And if he does let the descendants of Jeconiah rule, then he is a liar as well. Either way he goes, God ends up a liar. Road trip's over. Let's pack our bags and go home. This is where something of the necessity of the virgin birth comes into play. You see, Mary and Joseph were both descendants of David, but through different lines. Through Mary, Jesus was a physical descendant of David, though a different branch of the family tree. We see this in the genealogy in Luke's gospel. Joseph, however, was a descendant through the cursed line of Jeconiah here in Matthew. Joseph had the right to rule, but he carried the curse. However, Jesus was not his natural son. Jesus was only his adopted son. As his adopted son, Jesus inherited the right to rule on the throne of David, but he did not inherit the curse. Remember, the curse passed only to Jeconiah's physical descendants. At the same time, Jesus is still a physical descendant of David through Mary. It's brilliant. Just when you think God is in checkmate, God makes a move that no one could have predicted. Now, no one can ever prove to you that Matthew's account is true beyond the shadow of a doubt. But Matthew shows himself to be a reliable witness in so many ways, and there are verifiable facts to the story that almost miraculously survive to this day, housed in a museum in Berlin. Add to that all the details that point to hundreds of years of foreshadowing of what we see in the miraculous events surrounding the first Advent and Christmas. And we've only barely dug beneath the surface, and even then, only the first 17 verses of Matthew's gospel. Brother Bola was right. I was skipping over some of the best parts. In fact, there's one more detail that I can't leave out. I just can't do it. If you count out the generations in Matthew's genealogy, you may find that it's hard to figure out how Matthew comes up with 14, 14, and 14. Try as I might, I come up with 14, 14, and 13. Maybe Matthew is just bad at math, right? I don't think so. He was a tax collector. The last group of 14 needs one more generation in order to be complete. There were so many people that Matthew didn't include. Couldn't he just add one more to make the set complete? Many scholars believe that Matthew intentionally left the last group of 14 incomplete because the 14th generation is you. It's me. It's us. We have a part to play. All of us. Too often, we make the search for truth out to be a purely intellectual affair. Once we discover truth, many of us can be tempted to feel like we're done. Faith itself becomes a matter of just giving intellectual assent to the correct doctrines. But as we'll see in coming weeks, believing the truth is only one dimension to our faith. There are other questions, other endeavors that involve not just uncovering truth, but being authentically real, doing good, and creating beauty and justice. And we'll be looking into those questions in the coming weeks. But for now, I think it's important to recognize that truth is not the end of our journey. It's just the beginning. It's an invitation to respond to the truth, to engage with it, to allow God to use it to transform how we live and love. Joseph loved Mary despite how the world saw her as a suspect, just like all the other women in this genealogy. When Joseph falsely but understandably believed that he had been betrayed by Mary, even with a broken heart, he decided to do everything he could to protect Mary's dignity. It was only then that God revealed the truth to Joseph. Is it any surprise that God chose such people to be parents to God the Son? Considering the human ancestry of Jesus, Is it that surprising that Jesus would later reach out to lost and hurting people? People who were considered losers or shameful by society's standards? Instead, it was precisely those people that Jesus would count as friends and welcome as family. When I consider the shame drilled into me in my past, shame for who I was and where I came from, I am so relieved and delighted that the family of God is filled with people like these. And I'm so humbled that we are invited to continue this messy, dysfunctional, yet sacred lineage of Jesus. Are you like me? Is truth one of the most central questions for you? I encourage you to continue that search for truth. Never stop. Keep digging. I consider myself a spiritual seeker as well. But when you feel like you've uncovered all the facts, remember to keep moving forward. There's always more to the story. Indeed, there's the invitation for you to become part of the story. The missing 14th generation is you. And that's the truth.